make sure to give my dad a 5-star review.
Make sure to like and subscribe to his YouTube. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
White Christian nationalists actually are the most religious, even more so than Black Christian nationalists and Hispanic Christian nationalists. So there's something about if you're a white person and a Christian who goes to church a lot, you're probably more likely than not to subscribe to Christian nationalist views. Again, not all of those Americans who are white and Christian that go to church weekly, would subscribe to those views. I know a lot of Unitarians that are very active, in churches, and they're on the very far end of not being Christian nationalists. But generally speaking, those are some of the trends that we find. So I would say it's a religious movement.
Welcome back, Faithful Politics listeners and watchers. If you're joining us on YouTube, we're glad to have you. And we're glad to have you if you're just listening to us on the podcast. I'm your political host, Will Wright, joined by your faithful host, Pastor Josh Burtram. How's it going, Josh?
Doing well. Like, subscribe, do all those things, guys. Because
Yeah. Patreon and all that. Yeah, we have a presence. We just don't.
We have a Patreon. We have a Substack. Come on, guys, get involved. We try to put things out there.
Yeah,
and we're
true.
terrible at it. So help us out. Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, we're here today, joined back by Melissa Deckman. She is the CEO of the Public Religion Research Institute, or PRRI for short, where she leads one of the country's major research organizations studying the intersection of religion and politics. And she is here today to discuss the latest research they've done on Christian nationalism and what the data reveals about public attitudes across the United States. And we're just so glad to have you back, Melissa. Thanks.
Thanks, Will, Josh, for having me today. I'm glad to be talking with you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and we are too. And you're probably one of our favorite, pollsters. Is that wait, let's just back up. Is your title pollster?
How do you feel about that, by the way? You're like our favorite pollster.
I would respond to that. I would respond to pollster. Absolutely.
Okay.
I'm a political scientist. We're social scientists. We're analysts. But yeah, a lot of our work really does involve polling. So you can call me a pollster. I think it might have some negative connotations, but hopefully today I'll talk about why polling is good for democracy.
Got it. Well,
yes.
I won't use it in the pejorative, but today I am going to talk to you about some polling that you all did about Christian nationalism. But before we get to that, I want to talk, sort of 30,000 foot view. Like, what is it that you guys did? What's sort of the sample size, kind of like I said, large picture, what are kind of the bigger takeaways?
Sure. So this latest report comes from data we've collected throughout the year as part of our American Values Atlas. And this is a resource actually that's available to the public. So if folks are interested, they can actually go to our website and kind of do a search for the American Values Atlas. And you're able to look at all kinds of religious demography, but with respect to Christian nationalism, we look at the spread of this ideology through all 50 states. We're able to do it because the AVA relies on more than 22,000 interviews a year. And the beauty of that is that, one, you're able to actually map out across the U.S. the spread of these views in all 50 states, which is pretty unique. It's also really high quality data, so we invest in using what we'd call gold standard methodology, which basically means that we're still committed to doing probability-based sampling. There's a lot of bad polls out there. We could also talk about that today or at another different podcast. But essentially, I was a professor for many years, so I always tried to tell my students that they had to be good consumers of information. And so knowing the difference between a bad and a good poll and the methodology, we're very clear about how we collect the data. We have method statements, all of that. So this data then comes from our latest American Values Atlas set of data, interviewing more than 22,000 Americans and asking them essentially, their thoughts, their views on some Christian nationalist themes.
So when we think of Christian nationalism, it is like such a loaded term. I think in many regards, it's used sometimes as an insult. It's sometimes used to kind of describe things in society. Like, what are we talking about when we are actually talking about Christian? When you're polling or surveying for Christian nationalism, like how do we know you're actually surveying for Christian nationalism?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I think the big picture, maybe specific definitions might vary, but I think of Christian nationalism as a political ideology that holds that America was founded as a Christian nation and believes that we should remain a Christian nation. And so Christian nationalists essentially believe there should be very little separation between church and state, and that the government should really enact policies or privilege policies that endorse a very conservative theological interpretation of Christianity. So that in a nutshell is what I think of when I think of Christian nationalism. It's not something that's not necessarily new in our history. I think this has been around, it's from the founding times. There have been people who have subscribed to this ideology. But I think we're talking about it in today's politics because in recent years, Americans who ascribe to this sort of viewpoint are really becoming a larger part of the Republican Party and a part of the MAGA movement. And in this current second administration of the Trump administration, there are folks that have very high-ranking positions in his cabinet that I would argue hold these views as well. And so we're seeing policy changes at the federal level and in some state legislatures too, that really sort of endorse some of these Christian nationalist ideas, which we can get into a little bit later. But you are very right that a lot of Americans either don't understand what the term Christian nationalism means, or they believe it's pejorative. And so we don't go in the field and ask Americans, hey, are you a Christian nationalist? Please stand up, right? So what we do and what pollsters tend to do when you're dealing with a concept that has some complexity and ambiguity is that you try to do it in a way that develops a scale. And so we have, in fact, 5 statements we've developed that we've tested kind of from a statistical standpoint as well. So they kind of hang together. They're getting at the same sorts of tendencies. They're slightly different. But I know it's a little bit belabored, but I am going to read to you the 5 statements that we've asked Americans about. And so what we do, in our research is we ask Americans the extent to which they completely agree, mostly disagree, or completely disagree with statements that really are trying to unpack the relationship between Christianity, American identity, and government. So here are the statements. So do you agree that or disagree that the U.S. government should declare America a Christian nation? Do you agree or disagree that U.S. laws should be based on Christian values? If the U.S. moves away from our Christian foundations, we will not have a country anymore. Do you agree or disagree with that statement? Do you disagree or agree that being Christian is an important part of being truly American? And then finally, do you agree or disagree that God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of society? And some of those statements really were derived from looking at, leaders within those movements who've used those phrases over and over again, right? So it wasn't just out of thin air that we came up with these kinds of ideas and statements here. So based on that, and this is, by the way, the 4th report that we've issued in the last 4 years on Christian nationalism. So this is a methodology that we've used over these 4 years. And so it allows us to track trends with respect to whether it's growing or maybe dying in terms of like the movement in terms of the views of most Americans. And so when we look at that, we find that there are 4 groups of people based on how their answers are distributed according to this. So essentially, we identify Americans who are Christian nationalist adherents as those that basically completely agree with all 5 of those statements. So they're the most intense kind of supporters of that worldview. Additionally, we classify people who are sympathizers or sympathetic to the view as basically you mostly agree with them, maybe completely agree with 1 or 2. The flip side is that Americans who completely disagree with every statement, we classify as being people who are rejectors. And then finally, those that are kind of skeptical of Christian nationalism might agree with 1, but they largely disagree with those statements here. And so that ends up with this kind of breakdown of about 1 in 10 Americans. We find 11% of Americans in our survey qualify as Christian nationalist adherents, the most intense kind of commitment to those ideas. Another 21% are sympathizers. So about a third of Americans are in sort of the milieu of holding Christian nationalist beliefs to varying degrees, which means, of course, that most Americans don't, right? So it's basically about a 2-to-1 ideology. So about 2/3 of Americans say, nope, I'm not really on board with these ideas, whereas about a third of Americans are. And as we'll talk about today, there are certain groups in the country, whether it's by party or religion, who tend to be likely to espouse those views rather than not espouse those views.
Yeah, and I think the work is so important, and I'm really just thankful that you guys put the time in to do this work and to try to bring some kind of definition to it. Because again, I think in like Will says, I guess in terms of a lay person, we definitely would be considered experts from the normal person, their understanding of Christian nationalism. But we're not at the level of an academic, certainly, right, expert on this. And yet from my experience with interviewing the authors that write on it, people who believe in it, people that are fighting against it and trying to understand it and operationalize, like, what is this Christian nationalism? It seems like one of the biggest issues is these boundary markers, and it's at the threshold, right, between, say, something like a patriot or something like someone who would say, and again, I know those are distinct categories, a patriot versus someone who's a Christian nationalist, right? Or Christian patriotism, things like that. We even had an author on that talked about that distinction, like the case for Christian patriotism. And, I guess I would love to hear, like, when we're thinking about this group, it seems like even within the Christian nationalism label, there is diversity in terms of, like, maybe some people are like, hey, I would want all laws to be this, and this is what that means, and they're completely taken from the Bible and the Ten Commandments. And then there might be some other people that are like, no, I just, I think I would agree with these statements at some level, but maybe I don't want my neighbors kicked out. I don't want, I want religious freedom for everyone. I want whatever it might be. Do you find that there is a spectrum within that? And I guess, because of course we really want to know the boundary lines for when we're talking about something like this, especially if we're going to think about what risks there might be from this, or implications this is for our society, right? That this group is very accurate and that this is indeed a group. And I know that's what you're doing, but I just wonder if there's does the question make sense about the spectrum within it? And I'd just love to hear your thoughts on that.
Totally. In some ways, if you look at some of the individual questions, and we break this down in the survey, actually, I don't know if we do it in this survey as much as we've done in past surveys, but there is a range. Like, for example, the statements that I read out to you, like only about 20% of Americans agree that God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of society. That to me is that word dominion in particular, if you think about folks like Pete Hegseth, Pastor Doug Wilson, this kind of Seven Mountain Man state, these are people that are saying, hey, our version of Christianity should be really ascendant in just about every aspect of society. And I think that is not something that a lot of Americans would necessarily agree with. But, if you think about Christian values, right? And, I think, again, that's a term that can maybe be sort of subjective, but that's where we tend to have more Americans agreeing because, of course, like our Christian values, for example, loving your neighbor, right? Or our Christian values.
You could put me in that category.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So, yeah.
Right?
Okay. Yeah.
And so the dangers of just using one of those questions, right, is that it ends up being a lot more open to interpretation, right? But within, I think, Christian nationalism, I want to talk a little bit about what we find with respect to race in Christian nationalism, because a lot of people are often surprised. If you look at the racial breakdown, African Americans are just as likely as white Americans to be labeled as Christian nationalists, right? And I think for many people who are worried about Christian nationalism, especially as a threat to democracy, which we can talk about later, it's surprising to people because white Christian nationalists often have more extreme views on things like immigrants and really endorsing political violence and things like that. But what's really interesting if you look at the connection between race and Christian nationalism, we did an analysis a couple years ago where we used something called multivariate regression analysis. And not to bore your listeners, but essentially it's a statistical technique that allows you to control for a variety of factors to kind of get at the real underlying roots of what's happening here. And so we divided Americans who were white, Hispanic, and Black into separate categories. And we wanted to look at, okay, what factors lead certain white Americans to be Christian nationalists, Hispanic Americans, Black Americans, all of that. And what we found is that education is linked. So the higher educated you are, the less likely you are to be a Christian nationalist. This was true for regardless of race. But it was also a very religious kind of movement here. So, right, attending church weekly, led people to be more likely to be Christian nationalists, or just having charismatic and holding prosperity gospel beliefs also tended to move people into that kind of category, being a Christian nationalist. And notably, African Americans tend to be more religious than white Americans. And so that's part of explaining what we're having here. But politically, Black Christian nationalists and white Christian nationalists and Hispanics, very different, right? So being Republican makes white Americans far more likely to be Christian nationalists. And And for African Americans, that didn't really necessarily explain their tendency to be Christian nationalists. So for, I think, many African Americans, it's a religious kind of phenomenon. And, this is not me doing this, but we've had some terrific public fellows at PRRI who've kind of looked at this a little bit more, including Michael Fisher. He's a scholar at Ohio State University. And so what he essentially has written is that the idea of a Christian nation for many African Americans is very aspirational, right? And their theology looks at wanting to have America reflect the equality and justice found in the Bible's teaching, especially in brown and in Black churches. This is also some findings that Ainsley Kurios, another public fellow, wrote about. And you can find these things on our website, actually, in Spotlight Analyses. But the political implications here is that, for example, African Americans who are Black Christian nationalists, are far more likely to say that white supremacy is still a problem today, like more than twice as likely as white Christian nationalists. They're far more likely to say that discrimination is still a bigger problem for African Americans than white people. They're far less likely to say that immigrants are invading our country, right? Great replacement theories. So, and of course, it's not as though Black Christian nationalists are voting for Donald Trump at higher numbers either, right? So it's very complicated but nuanced, but I think it's important to kind of illustrate, to your point, Josh, some gradations within kind of Christian nationalism itself. I know that answered your question or started more questions for you.
It absolutely answered my question and put more questions, but I love that because then we can, move down those pathways.
Yeah, I have a question that just popped up that is probably for like nobody else listening or watching, but for me. And that's because I just recently reread Taking America Back for God. And, Whitehead Perry, they, define Christian nationalism. They use a bunch of survey, I think Baylor or something like that. And they crafted this, cultural framework sort of definition. The questions they use are different than the ones that you all use. And I don't know why that's important for me to know, but it feels like it should be. So because they define Christian nationalism, with these sort of set of questions. You all are defining Christian nationalism under these set of questions, but you both are talking about the same thing, I think, right?
Yeah, so I think I don't have the book in front of me. I've read it. I mean, as Sam and Andrew are terrific sociologists, I really respect the work that they do. I think their measurement tends to be a little more generous in its definition. So they tend to have a wider percentage of Americans who fall into their categories here. I think what's more important is not necessarily the specific questions, right? Because we vetted the questions, their questions I think are decent, all of that. But if you look at the different trends, they're still finding, for example, that white evangelicals are far more likely to be Christian nationalists. We find similar trends. They're still finding that, for example, church attendance and religiosity is linked to these sorts of things. So they're finding that Christian nationalists tend to have the same kinds of views on different policies that we do. So I think the more important point is that we're finding some similarities in the implications of who people or Christian nationalists are. So, but I think it's a good point. And if I had the book in front of me, I could maybe do a line by line. But I think the larger point to me is that we're measuring similar things and reaching similar conclusions, generally speaking. And I think that's a good sign of that. This is actually a real phenomenon happening, I would say.
Yeah, I agree. And just so I'm not trying to create some sort of inter-academic war or battle.
We can take it. Academia this is everyday works. Come to a panel.
Start the nerd war.
Come to a panel at a conference and you will get into these very picayune battles.
And that's so funny. No, but your recent survey also pointed out, and you wrote about it, about some unique things in specific states, that some unique findings. I'd love for you to just kind of unpack that for me. What did you find?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you were to overlay the Electoral College map onto our map of Christian nationalism, you would find that states that tended to vote for Donald Trump in 2024, far more likely to have state residents who espouse Christian nationalist ideology. Or if you find, for example, that blue states also tend to have fewer Americans in those state residents that have Christian nationalist ideology. And so even though we know we have this national average of about a third of Americans falling into our categorization of Christian nationalist adherents or sympathizers, there's really a deep range among the states. So I think the lowest level we found was in the state of Massachusetts. It doesn't get more Democratic, big D Democratic than the state of Massachusetts. Only about 15% of residents are Christian nationalists. Whereas you go to some of the reddest states on the map, we have about 4 or 5 states in the deep South that have a majority, like Arkansas, for example. These are states that have very large percentages of Republicans in state legislatures, but also states that tend to have the highest favorability ratings of Trump, or essentially those states overwhelmingly voted for Donald Trump in the midterms. And then that means you have the purple or swing states where it tends to kind of skew closer to the national average, lo and behold, right? And so the states that I think are more up for grabs in different elections are often those that tend to kind of, again, skew toward the middle. I think it helps to explain, too, as a political scientist, that, why some states are intractably red and intractably blue. If you think about it through the lens of Christian nationalism, this helps to explain what's happening as well. That's why, for example, if I look at the midterm election Senate map, you can kind of tell if this state has more than half of residents who are Christian nationalists, the odds of, Oklahomans voting for a Democrat for Senate are probably pretty low, right? And vice versa. I live in Maryland, where there tend to be fewer Christian nationalist adherents. Is a pretty solidly blue state. Not that those things never happen, but the odds of it, I think, are pretty small.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I want to think about for a minute, if you could help us work through the religious practices of Christian nationalists. So I've heard conflicting things. I've heard some people, or I've heard the idea that Christian nationalists are very, like people that would be in the sympathizer adherents, that they're very religious, right? So that they're very committed churchgoers, things like that. I've heard also that they're not, that there isn't a core. But I would love for you to kind of help straighten that out if you can. How much do we know about the religious practices of adherents and sympathizers vis-a-vis, say, the other groups of people, right?
Yeah.
Are they more religious? Do they attend church more? Do they give more? These kinds of things.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one narrative you often heard, especially as Trump was being reelected, is that, well, these are Christian in name only. Like, these are folks who might say they're evangelical in a survey, but they're probably not very religious. We find the exact opposite, in fact. And we have a kind of a section in this current report where we look at religious practices. So Christian nationalist views are far more prevalent among Americans who frequently participate in religious activity. So Christian nationalists are far more likely to go to church weekly. Just to give you some data points here. So a majority of Americans who attend religious services weekly or more qualify as either Christian nationalist adherents or sympathizers, like 55%, 54%. So majority of Christian nationalists, if you're going to church, you're probably more likely to be a Christian nationalist than not, 54%, compared to, say, 4 in 10 Americans who attend church at least a few times a year. We find similar patterns when it comes to reading scripture and to praying weekly. So it's a really religious movement, I think. And notably, this is kind of interesting, getting into the nuance again. We do find that more so than Black Christian nationalists and Hispanic Christian nationalists. So there's something about if you're a white person and a Christian who goes to church a lot, you're probably more likely than not to subscribe to Christian nationalist views. Again, not all of those Americans who are white and Christian that go to church weekly, would subscribe to those views. I know a lot of Unitarians that are very active, in churches, and they're on the very far end of not being Christian nationalists. But generally speaking, those are some of the trends that we find. So I would say it's a religious movement.
Yeah, I just real quick. Well, sorry, I just am thinking so. Is there, I guess in all of this, I know that we want to create a neutral definition, right? But there seems to be this very much, it is a firebrand, I don't know, lightning, whatever what is it that when it actually distinguishes you from other people, it is a culturally dividing issue, and the term itself is now, I think, maybe years ago it was not understood. I think it's still widely not understood, but I guess they're going to get it, and it's not going to come to someone. It's either going to come to them in a pejorative sense, or maybe, I don't think it's going to come to anyone in a neutral sense, I guess is what I'm getting at. And I think that I know a lot of people that would think that would absolutely be in the sympathizer and adherent that I very much love, and they're very good people, good neighbors, good citizens, all that stuff, and they don't hate people, right? So I guess I want to just bring out the tension of people might hear this and they might immediately think Christian nationalists are bad, or Christian nationalists are good. And I guess, do you have any, how would you respond to that, I guess, in your position as professional and the data that you've seen?
Yeah. I think what I worry about when it comes to Christian nationalism, and I'm not suggesting, I mean, I think we all probably know people that we like or even love, our neighbors who have, who are devout Christians, right? Or devout in their religious viewpoints and who aren't, necessarily looking to get rid of every immigrant in the United States, for example, here, because we have this big immigration crackdown that's currently happening, which, by the way, a lot of conservative Christian nationalists would say it's kind of part and parcel of what they espouse, because we find in our data that Christian nationalists, like over two thirds of adherents believe in the Great Replacement theory, which is really it's a terrible conspiracy theory, right? That Black and brown people are brought here to replace white Americans and replace our culture, and they're voting illegally. All of these sorts of things, which are very, very negative. But, one of the reasons I think it's so important to understand the implications of Christian nationalism is that it's really a worldview that rejects small d democratic pluralism. And what I mean by that is that I think the country, should be founded on this notion, and has been founded. It's imperfect maybe from the time that we set out at the beginning, but generally the idea that individuals, regardless of their religious belief, their race, their gender, their class, they should count fully as Americans and they should have a seat at the table. And what's troubling is that those Americans who really strongly subscribe to some of these viewpoints would say that's not the case at all, right? And so that's why, you have people certainly in some state governments and certainly within the Trump administration, for example, saying that pastors can now endorse candidates, right? It used to be very much like your taxes and static was really linked to the idea that we separate church and state here. Getting rid of all DEI efforts in the federal government and trying to enforce really cultural changes at American universities, right? Dismantling the Department of Education. There's all like defining male and female in biological terms, one of the first things that Trump did when he was in office. These are things that Christian nationalists, who I think have often very hierarchical thinking, right? The world, women are should be subject to men, all these sorts of things. So all of these things I think are viewpoints that I think don't allow Americans to fully participate in our government, in our societies, in our communities. That's where I think it becomes kind of problematic. It's also, frankly, and maybe I should have said this at the beginning, but Christian nationalism is not the same thing as Christianity, right? And so I think we're having very vigorous debates about that kind of right now. And I find it really interesting that you're seeing like on the religious left, some pastors who are compelled to run for office because they believe that the term Christianity has been hijacked by a more politically, theologically conservative movement. So, I mean, it's gotten to the point where this is one of my favorite data points, but, I think about Doug Wilson, who is, again, linked with Pete Hegseth in Moscow, Idaho. He's basically argued that wives should not be allowed to vote, right? We should repeal the 19th Amendment. If you would have told me a decade ago that anyone was discussing this in rational terms, but I think here we are.
Yeah, I would have been shocked.
I know, social media.
I think we should be shocked.
But that's an idea that is being discussed quite seriously, right? And it's a viewpoint that most Americans don't have. Will it come to fruition? Probably not. But I think we need to be talking about it,
But you would say that most adherents and sympathizers have that view, or no, or we don't know, or is that more fringe?
We don't know. That's an empirical question.
Okay.
Maybe on our next survey.
That is, you're right.
We can ask
good.
about that, But I do know, for example, though, that Christian nationalist adherents and sympathizers, especially adherents, have very, very strict roles about gender, right? And so we asked a lot in our surveys about, has society become too soft and feminine, right? It's a very good shorthand for understanding your viewpoints about masculinity in society. And overwhelmingly, Christian nationalists really believe that America is too soft and feminine. And so this kind of larger conversation about masculinity is linked to these gendered hierarchical views. And that potentially I think is bad because, you're basically saying this is kind of the predominant view that men should be in charge, and you kind of see it playing out, I think, within some elements, at least some elements of the GOP today.
When you said earlier that those states that really showed a stronger concentration of Christian nationalism, and you mentioned that if you put an electoral map on top of it, it's very telling. Do you find that in some of those states with a higher concentration of Christian nationalists that these are the states where you see like the 10 Commandments, trying to be pushed through legislation or Bibles or the laundry list of things that like Project Blitz and other stuff list that they want to try to do?
Absolutely, right? I mean, it's if you were to look at sort of surges in state legislatures that have tried to, well, these are states that also, if you look at just abortion, that these are states that, with the overturning of Roe and the Dobbs decision, have put in very strict restrictions on abortion. And by the way, we find that most Americans support abortion legality, even a lot of people of faith. I mean, we can have debates about that kind of conversation, certainly, but those are states that have really rushed to make, I think, very strict policies that prevent women to access this procedure. But also on public education, one of my very first books many years ago was about the Christian right and school board elections. And it's we've come full circle here, but there is a rush to essentially mandate Bible reading in some states, the posting of the Ten Commandments. I think in Louisiana, the court's hearing something, the Supreme Court's going to kind of review a policy that mandates that the Ten Commandments be, upheld in public schools. And part of that is because you have a Supreme Court that I think is far less concerned about establishment, the clause of the First Amendment, and more sympathetic toward religious liberty, that essentially people should have the right to do these sorts of things. So this is going to be an interesting case when it finally does appear, because really in 1980, the court ruled that having the Ten Commandments was a violation. It was basically akin to an establishment here. But yes, I think there is, again, this big tendency to try to really have more religion in public schools. And I'd argue what isn't talked about as much, but, in the dismantling of the Department of Education, which was one of Trump's first acts, that's long been a goal of many conservative Christians, because they'd rather see resources and taxpayer funds allow them to do charter schools or to do private school vouchers. And so there's been a long attempt to try to get, the federal government out of public education and return to the states. And in states where you have higher rates of Christian nationalists, you tend to have more generous voucher programs for private schools, and which some public education experts are really worried about because it bleeds resources from public schools.
Sorry, that was I just needed to give up that big thought.
I went down a tangent there.
Because I was thinking to myself, like, as you were talking, I mean, like the data shows all the things that Christian nationalists have been trying to do. And even before, like, maybe Christian nationalists, was really a measured phenomenon, like the Brown v. Board Education, and then you're like, hey, why are they trying to get rid of the Department of Education? Then it's just like, hey, just research Christian nationalist involvement there, and it'll unpack an entire world of information. But one world of information that you also unpack that I'm curious about is news consumption and media. So I'm curious on one, what does the data show? And then two, why is that relevant?
Absolutely. So we asked Americans routinely where they're likely to get their sources of news and information. And there's a very strong, I think, linkage between where you're getting your news and what your views are. So, for example, again, bearing in mind that about a third of the country qualifies as adherents or sympathizers in terms of Christian nationalism, Americans who say that far-right news outlets, folks, these are sources like One America, or there's a couple others that are kind of far to the right. Newsmax, So we find that about almost 2/3 of those individuals are Christian nationalist adherents and sympathizers. We find that a majority of Fox News viewers also tend to be adherents or sympathizers. And so I think, and the flip side, though, is if you are getting your news primarily from newspapers, isn't that quaint in today's times, but some Americans do, those Americans, only about 16% are Christian nationalist adherents or sympathizers, just 4% are adherents. So, or getting them from more I think, mainstream news, like your ABC News, things like that. So there is a real strong, I think, correlation. It's kind of a chicken and egg. Is it that you have these views and you're drawn to these sources, or is it that you're watching these sources and it kind of leads you to have these views? I think what happens is it just reinforces your pre-existing views anyway, right? As Americans, we tend to gravitate toward social circles or media outlets or sites online or podcasters that just kind of reinforce some of our views. It's interesting, in terms of looking at the relationship between churches and Christian nationalism or these kinds of beliefs. Even if you attend a church and you're, let's say, a devout white evangelical going to church regularly, you're involved in Bible study, you sing in the choir, you do all these sorts of things. You're at church maybe a couple of hours a week, but if you're going home and you're watching Fox News or a far-right news service or listening to a podcaster who espouses these views, it's just reinforcing your network, and you're not getting information that challenges those worldviews. Similarly, if you're at home all day only watching MS Now and reading liberal bloggers, you're not necessarily hearing what other people are saying is in addition. So I think that's a larger concern for democracy. But clearly, there are patterns that help to explain why some Americans have Christian nationalist views that are based on how people are consuming their media.
This reinforcing idea really got my gears turning, because I'm in the process of writing another blog about Christian nationalism, and kind of trying to address the, if you think that America was founded as a Christian nation, like, you may not necessarily be a Christian nationalist. And it may not even be your fault that you believe that, because like you may live in this like information bubble where like you heard it in your house growing up, you heard it from your pastor, and now you're hearing it on the news, and now, you go to a private school or you're homeschooled, and now you're hearing it from school. So it's like, and now you get somebody like me that says, yeah, America wasn't founded as a Christian nation. And then you're like, what are you talking about, Will? Like, what do you know? So like, do you have data that kind of shows these other sort of reinforcement mechanisms that kind of help keep this sort of like idea alive?
That's good. I don't think we have anything in the survey data, but I think you point out like, we've made it very easy in our society for people to isolate and only hang out with people that are just like them. And that's not good for democracy. That's actually why I'm very passionate about public education, because I think this is one of the last vestiges where people with differences have to connect, right? In society.
That's really good.
The military,
yes,
right? Or there are places where you have to kind of grapple with people that are different. And differences aren't bad inherently.
Great point.
Right? And so, when we're siloing in and homeschooling folks, and of course Americans can do that, that's their right. But generally speaking, I think it's better for society to kind of learn that people have differences. And just because they're different doesn't mean that they're the other. And we tend to I think the problem with extreme ideologies is that or authoritarian regimes is that the other gets blamed because they're different. And then, I think that, leads to justifications for political violence or for illiberal mechanisms where we suspend elections or limit the access to the ballot for some people, et cetera, all those sorts of things. But again, I don't really have a data point that shows like essentially, people that have the view that America was founded as a Christian nation, what sorts of other things are they getting and hearing and reading about? I mean, this is what I like to say. Like I had taught for many years a course on religion and politics. We always started with the founding era. And I think it's true that America was founded by many Christians, but there was an opportunity to establish a theology, a theocracy. And I think many of those founders came from nations where church and state were fused together, and it led to lots of problems, right? So I think it was actually, in some ways, even providential that they decided to firmly kind of unpack those sorts of things from one another. I think about the writings of Thomas Jefferson, who was famously a deist, but he was a big proponent, right? Even when he was in Virginia, in the colonies, of one of the first laws that really established the separation and these laws about religious consciousness to really kind of keep those things separate, because it would protect not only the religion, but the state as well. And so I think that's really more what our founding is. Doesn't mean that there weren't Christians who founded it, but I think there is some mythology being espoused that there's a very sectarian view of Christianity that was supposed to be happening in our founding period. And that's really kind of what we should harken back to. And I just don't think that's kind of realistic, frankly.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And do you mind if I process something out loud with you as like this like amazing mind when it comes to all this history of religion in our nation, and then the the sociological aspects of this? And it's because of the people that I know and love that would be in this category. Right. And I'm thinking like many of them, if you press them, they're like, I don't want a theocracy, right? They're not dominionism. I guess like even what in your numbers, like 23%, would be it like, right. So it's like many people are like, I don't want that. I don't want my, again, like my Muslim neighbors, like I want them to be able to flourish, but I do think that this nation should be based on Christian values, right? So that was one of the statements. And then the dominionism. And so, right, you'll have these people, even in like thinking about their race and how there's clearly differences in the way that someone who is Black that would be in a Christian nationalist, right, in that category of adherent and sympathizer, and how they would think about, again, like you said, several different major issues, right, that distinguish them from those who are white that are in that category. And as I'm like thinking about this and thinking about this group, I'm like, I'm trying to, I guess here's where my worry is. My worry is that if Christian nationalism or nationalist becomes this pejorative, that this truly like huge block, I mean, if it's 30%, right, or more, right, so that's 21 plus 11. So what's that, 32% of the nation fits into adherents or sympathizers? That's not a majority, but that's a massive block of the United States, right? So that might say to them, I'm not alone and this is my people. And then what if they get like taken by the worst of that because this other side's like, you're a Christian nationalist and you're bringing about the destruction of our nation. And it's just this all like throwing back and forth the same accusation, you're bringing about the destruction of our nation. But it's just starting at different foundations. And I guess the tension I'm feeling is that so many people probably would not agree with the most extreme versions of the dominionism that you're seeing. And yet maybe because of the pejorative nature of Christian nationalists, that label and the way that people talk about it, or it gets thrown out and even used in an angry, pejorative way, they might even, it's almost like you're chasing them into the arms of the lover you don't want them to go to, because they're the ones that are going to give them community and acceptance.
I think that's
anyway,
yeah, no,
go
that's
ahead. I would love to hear your thoughts.
In the sense that, I think one of the things that fuels this movement and gives it such, I think, political ascendancy right now in this moment is that it really, how do I say this diplomatically? It kind of wallows in grievance, right? This essentially that they're really speaking to people's grievance of a time that has a mystical, I think even a nostalgic time that never really existed, And so like I saw a clip of Doug Wilson talking about, I guess there's going to be a show on CNN and he had a clip about, why his movement was important. And really, we just really want to return to a world where like my grandfather had it. I was like, okay, so back when your grandfather was around, this is a time when, maybe women didn't have the right to vote, that African Americans really did not have access to civil rights. So I think there's like a nostalgia there that is, it's great for some people who are on the top, typically white, straight, men, right? And wanting to return to that. That's kind of, I don't think, the world that we live in. And I don't think it's the one that most people want to go back to. But, nostalgia is a heck of a drug. Like people really, I think one of the things that was so powerful when Donald Trump first ran for office was that he talked about making America great again. It was the again part. Because for a lot of people, they felt like economically, they hadn't gotten ahead. There were changes happening in the world that they didn't understand or appreciate, often too fast. And in fact, I think why Christian nationalism has, especially white Christian nationalism, has become so ascendant and powerful as a movement is because they're seeing changes in the past decade or so that they just can't get on board with, right? America is becoming far more secular. The fastest growing group religiously in this country are Americans who aren't religious at all. They looked at the election, frankly, of the first Black president, Barack Obama, as a challenge to kind of the hierarchical worldview. They've looked at the rights of LGBT Americans, right? So during, Obama's time in office, same-sex marriage became legal. And in fact, more Americans have been far more accepting of gay and lesbian people, which I think is a good thing because pluralism is about expanding the table, having all voices come aboard. But if you really believe strongly that homosexuality is something that's not right and not according to God's plan, these sorts of things all, I think, are challenging to your worldview. And I think it's given some ascendancy to this movement politically. So that's why I think it's important to study and to kind of name it. But yeah, it's important to keep tabs on it. That's what I would say in terms of our democracy and the health of our democracy.
And the only thing, I'll just say this and pass to you, Will, because I've had people reach out to me, multiple people, and essentially it's like, we don't like Donald Trump. He's a maniac, but we're not going to. I'm not going to go into a party that is so against my values, and it's like if there is a way that you could open up the door for people, if they had a way out, I think they would take it. That's what I'm saying. If they had a way out that they could go and say, I can hold on to my values, I can hold on to my deeply held convictions, and I don't have to be kicked out because of that, like I basically have no choice. I have now, and now Donald Trump is saying he's going to fight for me and for Christians like me, whether other Christianity is okay, great, but you're asking people to move against their incentives, which is so hard to do. It is so difficult for people to move against the incentives they have in their life. I think we underestimate that to our peril, and we have to create a space for people that can come in and not, again, many times people say, I'm sick of being called racist, homophobic, transphobic, whatever it might be, right? And so again, it's like we need to find a way to shift this language, because we are just pushing each other apart. And I just think it's so important. Anyway, sorry, well, go ahead. You're still muted, dude. Sorry.
Oh man, I just did the Zoom thing, didn't I?
And then I did the Zoom thing because I muted and I said, you're still muted. And I was muted. And poor Melissa's sitting there like, is anyone going to tell him that he's muted?
Awkward. I'm usually on the receiving end of that, so I'm delighted not to be muted myself. So it's all good.
Yeah. Well, my last question for you is, like it's just so much data to really kind of go through. And, I'm sure you're probably familiar with this. People will look at your data, they'll pull out the things that they can use to kind of make, the other side look bad, or whatever. And But there's a lot that the data doesn't say. And I'd love for you just to kind of just address that, because I think that the problem with data, when you're looking at the kind of data you all look at and you're trying to wade through it and make sense of it and create kind of an explanation about it without necessarily interjecting yourself into the explanation. I don't think that people who interpret the data on the media or in the news necessarily, have that same kind of consideration. So what does the data not say for us looking at it?
That's a great question. I kind of want to return to a point I was trying to always make the case why public opinion polling is important in a democracy, right? I think that survey research and public opinion polling is really one of our most widely understood tools for understanding human behavior, attitudes, social patterns. I think, too, it serves as a check on people in power, because it's not to say that the public is uniform in their beliefs. A lot of times they are. But if you have a situation where a government, whether it's at the state level or federal level, is really acting in wildly different ways than what most Americans, think, that's something that we need to discuss. And I think we need to kind of, our responsibility as pollsters is to kind of bring that, bring that to attention, because we have a representative democracy. But it's also not perfect because, again, it tells us outcomes that might be most probable for different groups of people. So we know, for example, that about 2/3 of white evangelical Protestants fall into the category of being Christian nationalist sympathizers or adherents. But we also know 1/3 of them don't, right? So how do we explain those folks, right? And so, a good friend of mine, Ruth Braunstein, who's at the Johns Hopkins University, she had a really fantastic documentary series called When the Wolves Came that really kind of talks about Christian nationalism in Arizona. This was during the heat of the election and after COVID. And she actually is interviewing Pastor Caleb Clark. I can't remember his exact name.
Campbell, probably.
Yes, that's it. Yes, yeah. So you've heard of this guy. So he's essentially was raised in that kind of environment, deeply immersed in sort of Christian nationalism, and also ultimately just had a change of heart and said, this is really not what the gospel should be about. And but it was deeply dividing. His congregation was torn in two, people left, all of this was happening, right? But, again, what she likes to point out, she's got a great Substack called Democracy is Hard, that surveys can lead to probabilistic thinking. It doesn't allow us to imagine maybe, what do we see in the unexpected? How do we change things, right? How can we break patterns that we see? And so I think it's a good conversation starter. I think it's good to be aware of these sorts of things for many, many reasons. But again, how can we map out the outliers? Like sometimes I'm drawn to the outliers in cases too, like what's going on with them? What's making them tick? And so in some ways, again, survey research is great, highly effective, efficient, telling us large trends, but there's stories that get lost in that. So I think it's always good to kind of bear that in mind.
Yeah, I really like that. And this is my last question. And it's going to go back to something that we have touched on. And it was in, probably around the middle of our conversation. Essentially, you said something like, we we don't even share the same moral universe. You didn't use those words, but the idea that like we literally have different sources, right, of information we're getting from, like we are in different siloed shared realities. Yes. And I wanted, something that it hit me the other day, because we had Matthew Bodie on to talk about his book on the Seven Mountain Mandate and working through Turning Point. And he's been on twice, and he's a great, good friend of the podcast. And, and we even had people from Turning Point though on as well to talk about their perspective. And so we always want to do that and try to get to the understanding, because we have to understand each other. So anyway, but when Matthew Bodie was on, that was the first time I connected to actually who Charlie Kirk was. I didn't even know who Charlie Kirk was. Okay. Right. So I consider myself evangelical. I consider myself conservative. I consider myself all sorts of things. And yet I did not know who Charlie Kirk was enough to connect a name to a face. And people were surprised by that, literally millions. So how is it? And so at the beginning, I'm like, hey guys, back off. I didn't even know who this guy was. And like now that I'm figuring it out, I'm supposed to have an opinion on him. And it's like, I don't even know, like, how do I even catch up? And so I was almost defensive posture. But then as I'm thinking about it, I'm like, this is unbelievable that I would have so many friends, so many people, so millions of people know this person that I couldn't connect a name to a face. And it's not millions of people that are strangers, people that were my friends. And it made me realize the power. I have my case because I'm using my phone for a camera, but the power of the phone, right? In how we are quite literally like millions of people. Some of my best friends knew who this person was and I didn't. And they were being influenced by them. And I had no clue who he was. None. I had never heard of him. And then I realized, I've seen that guy on some reels lately that started coming in for some reason. And then now, and I'm sitting there and my mind is blown. And I think all of our minds should be blown. That literally that many people, and people getting so upset that other people haven't heard of him and other people are disrespecting him. They didn't know who he was, right? They literally were living in a different universe, and we're all so angry at the other person because it's so obvious to us. And now these things have made it so that our bias is, amplified to a place of dangerous proportions. And it's like, can we give each other a break? And so when I'm thinking about this, coming back, how do you think that these phones, how is this fueling what's happening? And where do you see solutions as we're moving forward?
That's the $1 million question. Like, how do we get out of this, right? Because we're so entracted in our networks and, this lack of good faith, right? To kind of give people the benefit of the doubt in society. We don't seem to have a lot of goodwill toward each other. And when in fact, I think if you look at some polling, most Americans can agree that they want to live in a place that's safe. They want to have a good standard of living. They want their kids to have, more opportunities than they had, right? We want to advocate for peace. And there are broad structures of things that we all agree on. How we get to that and what the policy solutions are certainly different. But, it takes a lot of hard work. And, there's a program called Better Angels. I don't know if you've heard of this, but maybe something a group to bring on. But I have a good friend that teaches at McAllister College, and she's involved in it. And so she's a political scientist. And so they've partnered with the local Christian conservative college. McAllister is pretty liberal arts college, right, in St. Paul. And so their students would meet once a week and have coffee, and they develop these incredible friendships. And so that's an example where you can bridge divides, speak civilly. These are all very good things, but that's labor intensive, right? And so a lot of Americans just don't have the time or the inclination to want to do that, because it's a lot easier to do this than to actually meet people, face to face. It has larger implications aside from democracy, which I'm very concerned about, obviously. But, like young people aren't dating, right? Because it's a lot easier to kind of be online and to follow Instagram or other YouTube than it is to do the hard work of meeting people face to face. And, it's tough. I think one area of research, like especially, for example, looking at trying to prevent political violence, because whether you agreed or disagree with Charlie Kirk, political assassination is just, it's a horrible thing. This is not where we should be in our country, right? No one should be applauding it, all of it, right? But, one thing that does work in terms of reducing political violence is having leaders who are willing to kind of tone down the tone. Local leaders, clergy, librarians, and so school teachers, people that they're local police, there are individuals in our societies where people still have respect for and more confidence in kind of at this local level. But it also, frankly, starts at the top. And I think we currently have a political leader, I'd argue, that does the exact opposite of toning down the rhetoric. I think at times of great strife, you need leaders willing to say, hey, let's take a beat. Let's kind of, speak to our better angels and maybe kind of tone things down. But, we have a society where it's kind of what I've heard, this idea that we live in a really attention politics dominates, right? How can you get attention? By saying the most ridiculous, crazy thing. And that gets rewards and likes and amplification. I'm not sure how we get back from that other than we just start going back to basics, meeting people face to face. One positive thing I will leave on a positive note here in terms of one broad bipartisan kind of thing I see happening in state legislatures, for example, is that we have recognized what the phones and social media have done to teenagers and young adults. And so there is a big movement to take those things out of the classrooms, which I think they obviously should. I think most parents agree with that. And, and so that I think is a positive because we know that, kids' brains on these things are not very good for many, many reasons. So I think there's a recognition, kind of like how we came to realize that smoking was terrible. Like we know that social media is really bad for kids, especially because they're younger and they're still evolving and all of that sort of thing. So that's maybe one bright spot that we come up with a real, recognition that we need to kind of get divorced from these things and maybe limit kids' access and all those sorts of things. But it's hard. It's really hard.
Yeah, it's really hard, and we're going to need a lot of wisdom and a lot of hard work in the future. And well, Melissa, we just appreciate so much your organization. How can people get connected to you guys, get connected to what you're doing? Where would you direct them at this point if they want to learn more?
Absolutely. So please go to our website, PRRI.org. You can sign up for our newsletters. We have a Substack page where we do new analysis. We have 3 times a week, we publish something called The Morning Buzz, where we kind of take a look at the news and how our data kind of speak to what you're seeing and helping you give maybe better understanding what's happening there. But yeah, please. One of the things that our public mission is that this data is publicly available. If you're a researcher, you can download data sets. I mean, we are really open and transparent about how we collect the data and making it available for individuals. I'd also encourage you, the work isn't free. So when people wanted to make a financial support, you can go online and also support our work as well. But really follow us. We're on different social media handles. As I'm talking about the evils of social media, please go follow us. This is one good outlet, right? But really go online, take a look at our
water
work.
We're in.
And please and share the results with people.
Yeah, and we're going to put all that stuff in the show notes so people can check it out. And again, Melissa, thank you so much for coming on the Faithful Politics podcast, spending some time and giving your insight to us.
Great. Thank you guys so much. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. And to our viewers, guys, this has been Melissa Deckman. We're going to put that stuff in the show notes. Go check it out. Go support PRRI. We love them. Huge fans, so go support their work. And until next time, guys, keep your conversations not right or left, but up. And we'll see you then.